Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Daniel Johnson. Daniel is a notable journalist in his own right. He's also the son of the late Paul Johnson, who was a great writer and a great journalist of his era. And we're meeting today in Paul's old library. Daniel, this room must bring back a lot of memories for you, I imagine.
It certainly does. It is in fact the room in which my father died, because latterly it became his bedroom as well. And he was always very happy here, surrounded by his books and pictures. Art was a very important part of his life as well as writing. He was both a good amateur artist himself and historian of art. But for him, art, literature, music, all these great sort of consolations of life were always part of the glory of God. You know, these were the things that, in the ways in which God manifested himself here on earth among us. And I think for him, his faith was an absolute rock. He was a deeply flawed man, as he often said, a sinner, but thanks to his faith, he was able to survive all kinds of turbulent vicissitudes in his own life and in the world that he lived through, a long life, well into his 90s, and to say something of lasting value about that world, as a historian, as a journalist, as a memoirist, as a biographer. And in particular, of course, he was very interested in the phenomenon of religion, of faith. He wrote a massive history of Christianity, a history of the Jews, biographies of two popes, a biography of Jesus, and also this book, a very personal book, The Quest for God, Personal Pilgrimage, he subtitled it, which was about his own faith.
He certainly had an absolutely prodigious output. I mean, it's just preparing for this interview, I was looking back at his work and yours also, but the amount of intellectual energy to accomplish that output of written work in one lifetime, it's extraordinary.
Yes, he wrote well over 50 books, and many of them very large. And he always used to say that when he got interested in a subject, he'd write a book about it, so he would teach himself. He was the ultimate autodidact, although of course he's a graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford, as am I. But he never had any desire to be an academic. And although he had many academic friends, I think he did rather feel that academic history was something different from what he was doing, because academics kept it to themselves, in the way they wrote and in the way they saw the world, whereas he thought history was an essential part of humanity and something which every educated, intelligent person should love as much as he did, and he did his best to spread his infectious enthusiasm for history wherever he could.
I think his genius, really, if I may say so, was to present to the ordinary non-specialist reader, like myself, a narrative flow which makes very complex subjects intelligible, and you're pulled through the story. I'm thinking, for instance, my favourite book of his is the History of the Jews, which I think manages in one volume to encapsulate a very complex subject, and does it in a way that is just enticing and absolutely riveting. Actually, he had a real gift for narrative history.
That's right, and the story of the Jewish people, which he tells in that book, is of course unique and extraordinary. I mean, he describes it as a miracle, the whole of it, but in particular the foundation and creation of Israel as a state, which is something he did live through and was very much involved with. He knew a lot of Israeli politicians, just as he had known, I think, every prime minister from Winston Churchill to Tony Blair, and every American president from Eisenhower to George W. Bush. At least that's what he said, and he certainly met most of them. And I think, in a way, a man of his sort of life experience was better placed to write about these huge subjects than someone who'd only remained in an ivory tower all their lives. He understood what it was like to be at the centre of events, to be swept up in great wars and revolutions and other dramatic events. And I think that helped him to master such a vast body of material. But at the core of the history of the Jews is the Bible, which is itself, of course, a history. It is a story. It is a chronology. And I do think that we should perhaps talk a little about how important biblical religion, Abrahamic faiths, if you like, Judaism and Christianity, have been in the whole history of humanity, and how essential the Bible has been to who we are. This is still the kind of master narrative of the ur-text, if you like, of Western civilization. And what happens if that is lost? If we cease to give it that central place in our minds.
Do you think that is what is happening? Is that what you fear has happened to us as a society? This that we have, in a way, jettisoned our understanding of this central text?
Well, I can remember immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I was privileged enough to cover as a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, and even to play a small part in. A French philosopher turned up in Berlin and said to me, "This is the end of the text," by which he meant the Marxist text. This was he rather prematurely thought that communism would disappear after the fall of the wall. As we can see, if you happen to live in China, that's not true at all, and a few other countries as well. But texts are still important, even in a secular world, Marx and so on among them. But I think what the Bible does is something much deeper than provide a sort of blueprint or guide or prediction for humanity. It tells us what it is to be human. It tells us how to live and how to die, how to worship God, and how to come back to Him when we've lost Him. When He seems remote. I mean, in the last chapter of my father's book, The Quest for God, which he says is the most important one, he writes about prayer, and he entitles it "Talking to a God we do not know and cannot prove exists." This is a difficult thing to do. I think that's implied in that title. And yet it's also the easiest thing to do, because opening yourself up, even if you hear nothing back, is something I think human beings have always done, literally, since they became human. And what the Bible does, I think, is to show us how to pray in the most simple and passionate and remarkable way. One of the things about Jesus' own prayer, the Our Father, is that it could easily be a Jewish prayer. It's not necessarily a specifically Christian prayer. There's nothing in that prayer that a Jew could not also pray. And that's one of the many wonderful things about both, well, particularly perhaps the Hebrew Bible, is that it encapsulates both faiths. Christianity is, if you like, the daughter faith of Judaism, and John Paul II, for example, and also I think Benedict XVI used to talk about Jews as our elder brothers, we as Catholics, and we must never lose that connection. I think as long as the Jewish people survives, then we will know that this story that the Hebrew Bible tells of their survival against all the odds embodies a great truth. Even if it is not all of it literally true, it embodies something that is profoundly true.
That's an intriguing observation about the Lord's Prayer, which has never struck me before, but how that underlines the continuity between the two faiths, of course. Tell me this, did your father hand on the faith to you? Was it for you, was there ever any problem about Catholicism, Christianity?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's impossible to be a Catholic without it being fairly problematic, because of this inevitable contradiction between the ideal, the counsel of perfection, and the reality, what our everyday life is like. I mean, one falls, one stumbles literally every day, and my father used to say that you had to say sorry for these things every single night. You had to sort of confess your sins and be sorry. I mean, I can't claim to have done that in my life. I certainly could never approach the level of his regular mass going and devotion. On the other hand, I do try, in my own way, to practice the values and virtues that Christianity has bequeathed us in everyday life, and I like to think that is actually what most people do, whether or not they ever go to church, or indeed to synagogue, or temple or mosque, whatever it is. I think most people try to be good. Most people have at least some sense that there is something beyond themselves, whether or not they call it God, but some sort of law, some moral authority to which they appeal. The trouble is that I think if you try to create a religion without God, it's much more difficult. I mean, I remember a book by the American legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin. I think it was called something like that, Religion Without God. And I remember thinking at the end, you know what, this is asking too much of people. Most people can't improvise a faith. They need the help of a tradition, a context, and they do need scriptures. They need stories. They need examples to follow. I think this is what is part of being human, and this is why I think that religion is hardwired into us. Historians like Robert Bellah, who studied prehistoric man and the sort of transition from prehistory into the historical era, they always find rituals, sacrifices, music, mythology from the earliest point. And then this gradually morphs into a more complex kind of faith, which is also perhaps more personal and more theoretical, with a sort of theology. But essentially it's the same thing, no matter how complex and sophisticated it is. I have at home great shelves full of books, the complete works of Thomas Aquinas and so on, these vast systems of theology. But in the end, we're all just bare, forked beings, humble before God. Because I think without humility, no amount of wisdom and knowledge is worth anything.
Just as you were talking there, I was thinking about some of the ancient sites in the UK. I visited Avebury Ring is somewhere I've been quite often, and an ancient place like that, it leads one to think that there has always been in humanity an intuition that there is a God, that there is a transcendental reality which is not apparent to us. But you have pursued the cause. I mean, you're a historian by training, but you have been a journalist, and an illustrious career you've had. You've already mentioned that you were the correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, and then you were the editor of Standpoint magazine, and now you run the Article online website. Journalism is a fairly rough and ready trade. It's a knockabout game. It's how has faith played into your journalism? How do you think it is that, or what difference do you think it has made to you as a journalist that you are also a believer?
It's a very good question and not an easy one to answer, but I would say that it may well have affected the kind of things I've written about. I have from time to time written about the churches, faith more generally, moral issues. It's also, I think, influenced me in the way that I've tried to approach the ethics of my trade. Perhaps one shouldn't call it a profession, but it is a trade. I've
agree on that.
I've tried to uphold a high standard, particularly when I was my own boss at Standpoint and now at the Article. It's a little more difficult when you've got an editor demanding things, and you have to deliver what the demands of the day are. But above all, I think a person of faith is always going to attach great importance to two ideas: truth and freedom. Truth, perhaps more obviously, because that is what faith is ultimately about. A commitment to the truth, a commitment to a quest, if you like, to get to the bottom of the story, to discern what are the essential elements of what is going on in some great complicated political crisis. And freedom, because I think that too, particularly, I would say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is right at the heart of what faith is about. Freedom of conscience above all, but that is a very broad freedom as I see it. It is not just a private freedom, it is a public freedom. It is the freedom to speak, to write, to hold the authorities accountable. That is right at the heart, I think, of what we are taught by Jesus, but also by the Old Testament prophets, many of whom suffered for their faith and set us a great example, I think, as journalists, speaking truth to power. And I would like to think that the most important moment, perhaps, of my entire journalistic career, that moment on the night of November the 9th, 1989, the press conference in East Berlin, where Günter Schabowski, the East German communist spokesman, was trying to announce a new policy which took everyone by surprise. And he explained that they were going to allow people for the first time to cross through the anti-fascist protection barrier, as they like to call the Berlin Wall. But he couched it in bureaucratic language which only those who understood would grasp the significance of. And then somebody said, so when does this come into effect? That wasn't me. Another journalist who was invisible on camera. And he said, well, immediately, which was not what he was meant to say. And then we got even more excited. But that wasn't the end of the press conference. I got the microphone at this point, and this time the cameras were right on me. And I said, so what will happen now to the Berlin Wall, which no one had even mentioned? And that completely stumped him. And there was sort of silence for about half a minute. A very long silence, during which I like to think, in a way, the Cold War came to an end. You know, that was a moment when all the millions of people watching suddenly thought, yes, what is the point of having a wall running through our capital city if people are allowed to go through it? He was trying to think of what the best lie to tell was, to cover up what he suddenly, I think, perhaps had some inkling he'd done, which was to destroy the entire edifice of totalitarian communism. But I like to think that being able to get to the heart of something, you know, just ask the simple idiot's question, is one of the things journalists are there to do, you know, to represent people in a sense, you know, because they can't all be there, and put powerful people on the spot. That's what good interviewers do, and you know all about that. But it's also what intelligent commentators and analysts and essayists do when they try to encapsulate in, you know, a few hundred or maybe a few thousand words what other people take books to write.
So your journalism has been informed by what is clearly a profound understanding of these matters. When you look around newsrooms that you're familiar with and have been over the years, I wonder if you'd agree with me, I see quite a lot of religious illiteracy in journalism these days. And I think that, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think that some of the problems which have afflicted us, for instance, the rise of militant Islam, these things have been misunderstood because a lot of journalists have very little understanding of the importance of religious belief in human affairs.
I'm sure that's right. I think 9/11 took everyone by surprise, but it shouldn't have done. It took us a long time to grasp what the challenge was. And it was a challenge not just to the United States or to the United Kingdom, but to a whole civilization, to Western civilization, as I like to call it. That was one reason why I founded Standpoint, was to defend what I saw as the embattled traditions, values, achievements of that civilization. And I think it's certainly true that completely secular people find it very hard to understand what motivates very extreme, fanatical, religious zealotry. They tend to play it down, they tend to underestimate it, or they may do the opposite, which is to sort of be intimidated by it. Whereas I think if you have a fairly solid grounding in a more moderate and compassionate and humane faith, and that, by the way, includes many Muslims, most Muslims perhaps, then you're better equipped both to understand but also to resist the lure of extreme and dangerous distortions of faith. But what I also think is that we live in a time when we have all kinds of substitute religions, all kinds of ersatz faith. One of these is what was called political correctness and now is known as wokery. Wokery, yes. And this is very obviously, as the historian Tom Holland has rather cleverly shown, a kind of Christian heresy. You know, it is a form of modern Puritanism or a kind of exaggeration of the moral seriousness with which, Christianity quite rightly approaches everyday life, but imposing a sort of arbitrary censorship, if you like, on our words and our feelings and our and even on, if you like, facts. An attempt to sort of impose an alternative universe on the one we actually live in. So that's an example of, I would say, a kind of ersatz faith. But there are others too, and I was very struck, for example, on a recent visit to the National Portrait Gallery, which has just been reopened, and like many of our museums, the captions on the pictures are rather hectoring and preachy. And what I noticed was the sort of common theme, and I don't think the NPG, by the way, is unique in this. I think that you'd find this in most of our major collections of art and artefacts nowadays, was an almost messianic hostility towards the British Empire, the colonial past, indeed to any idea that Britain might have something to be proud of, a sort of identity that others might find admirable, as well as ourselves. And so great figures from our history were reduced to what they did or didn't do, or said or didn't say about slavery or colonialism. And yet, what was completely missing from this, I thought, was any sense that Christianity was right at the heart of all the great reform movements of our history, including the abolition of slavery, which, after all, no other country in the world had ever embraced. And we didn't only abolish it for ourselves, we imposed that abolition on the rest of the world. The slave trade was suppressed by the Royal Navy. But you would never guess that from these captions. And I think that this brings us actually back to one of the core moral intuitions that Judaism and Christianity, I think, have bequeathed to us, which is that slavery is wrong. It's true that it took a very long time before the churches formulated this in a way that was universal, but it's there from the beginning. It's implied and even stated in both the Old and New Testaments, and you'll notice that actually there were no slaves in Britain. We had slaves in the colonies, and that was terrible, of course, and it should never have been allowed to happen. But here in Britain, already 1,000 years ago, St. Anselm, one of the great saints and theologians, states very clearly in a council document that there shall be no slaves here in Britain, in England. So it's pretty clear that was already very well understood, even if it took a very long time to actually be put into practice. So I think the role of Christianity as a revolutionary force for freedom, for equality before the law, for all the essential values that we associate with the West, is now almost entirely ignored. It's played down, it's excluded. You saw this, for example, in the proposed European Constitution. No mention of God whatsoever, and yet Europe wouldn't even exist were it not for Christianity. As a concept, as a sort of civilization. A little remarked aspect of the empire was that along with the traders and the battleships went the evangelizers, and many of the countries which were evangelized in, for instance, in the Far East and in Africa, were critics often
seem to suggest that that these were paradisal societies, which were, innocent natives having a wonderful time. Actually, they were brutal and unkind and unjust societies, very often tribal societies. Christianity, because of its revolutionary aspect, the way that it confers dignity on each individual,
Yes.
is of course something which upsets the status quo. And the way that the British Empire spread Christianity is, to my way of thinking, one of its great achievements.
Yes, I would agree with that. I realise, of course, that the very idea of missionaries is now anathema to most people here in our society. But if you look around the world, that's not how they see it. In most of the countries where Christianity has taken root, it's been absolutely at the heart of progress towards democracy, the rule of law, and a more civilized way of treating people. So I think it's been much more of a blessing than a curse. I'm not saying it hasn't been abused. Of course it has. One thinks of apartheid South Africa, for example. There are many examples like that. And in perhaps the greatest of all these places to which we transplanted our faith and our ideas, the United States, we see such a sort of spectrum of faiths, and some of them are not pretty. There are sort of ugly distortions of Christianity in the United States, and yet without its Christian core, I don't think the United States could ever have become the greatest, most powerful, and most freedom-loving country on earth, which it did. And it saved Europe twice in the last century, and arguably a third time in the Cold War too. So it's a matter of concern that the United States now seems to be moving rather in the same direction as Europe in becoming a secularized society. I wrote a long essay about this for the Jewish online platform Mosaic in 2020. This was during the pandemic, when all the churches and synagogues were closed. And it was a real question, what would happen when they reopened? Would people come back? And many priests and rabbis I talked to were very worried about this. It's turned out that most people have come back. The worst fears were not realised. But it was during that time, this is what prompted the essay, that for the first time in the United States, the number of people answering none when asked which church or synagogue or other faith are you attached to, the number of people with no institutional attachment to any faith exceeded half for the first time. And this is something which had never happened before in America, but which we're very familiar with in Europe, where practicing people of certainly of Christian or Jewish faith are in a small minority now. And this raises the question, are we still a Christian country? I think you can say that there's no question that the United States still is, in spite of these powerful secular forces that are afflicting it. But here in Britain, it is a genuinely open question.
The something I want to ask you is about the way in which Christianity and politics intermix. So, for instance, your father, Paul, started out as a man of the left, and yet was a believing Catholic, and actually became the editor of the great standard bearer of left-wing journalism, the New Statesman. I think it would be very difficult to conceive of that happening today, and I wonder that I think that I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I want you to answer this. Left-wing Catholicism, does it exist any longer? And if not,
well, that's quite a provocative question, because when I listen to Pope Francis sometimes, I do wonder whether the politics haven't slightly overtaken the Christianity. I mean, I have to say, and I speak as a Catholic, dismayed to hear him praising Peter the Great and Catherine the Great on a visit to Russia in the middle of this terrible war of extermination in Ukraine, and similarly on a visit to Mongolia, going on about what a great ecumenical figure Genghis Khan was. I fear that the Pope needs to go back to basics. But the great thing about our faith, anyway, Christianity, and this certainly goes for Judaism too, although Jews perhaps wisely don't have popes, is that you're allowed to criticise the clergy, however grand and important and powerful they are. My father, in his memoir, A Vanished Landscape, recalls sitting with his mother, a very, very devout Catholic, on her deathbed, in a convent this was, and he said, "Mother, you are going straight to heaven. You have never done any harm to anyone or anything wrong." She said, "I have often criticised the clergy." And he said, I think those were her last words. But I don't think that, I think that's a venial sin, as Catholics would say, not a mortal one. So one is allowed to take issue politely with popes and archbishops and cardinals. But I would say the Church, broadly speaking, has moved to the left, and I remember an interview I once did with Hans Küng, great sort of heresiarch, great German theologian who remained actually a priest, as he reminded me, in good standing to the end. So he never left the Church, but he seemed to have left pretty much all its core doctrines behind. And so after this quite sort of searching interview, he said, "I think you might be a conservative Catholic," in a very sort of resentful way, as though this was an illegitimate thing for me to be. But I do think that both in Judaism and in not just Catholicism, but the various Protestant forms of Christianity too, it's slightly easier now to be on the conservative side of politics than to be on the left. I think it's difficult to reconcile the orthodox teachings of either Christianity or Judaism with some left-wing dogmas nowadays, and that has made it harder, you're right, for someone like my father to achieve a senior position on the left. I mean, it was already difficult in his day.
He was criticised, actually,
yes,
wasn't he?
Yes.
He was.
One of the members of the board, that we're talking in the early 1960s, was Leonard Woolf. And he strongly opposed the idea of a Catholic being editor. He said, well, he's obviously obedient to the Pope, and we can't have that in an editor. He was overruled. But I think it's a misunderstanding, a common misunderstanding among non-Catholics, that Catholics are not genuinely intellectually free because of their faith. I mean, the great John Henry Newman famously said, I shall drink to the Pope, but I shall drink to conscience first. And he was a cardinal of the Church. So if he was allowed to say that, then lesser mortals are too. But to this, I know in one of your interviews you talked to Ruth Kelly, who was a senior cabinet minister under Tony Blair, and she found that very, very difficult to reconcile. the pressure she came under with her Catholic faith. Tony Blair himself didn't even admit to being a Catholic until he left office. So these are still serious factors. It's not been easy. Perhaps it's harder in some ways than at any time since Catholic emancipation in the 1830s. But I think it's not easy for Orthodox Jews either to survive in public life. The great Jonathan Sacks, who I knew fairly well, used to talk a lot about this, and how it was important not to compromise too much in your beliefs. You have a duty to put God first, to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but unto God what is God's. And where there is a conflict, God must come first.
It strikes me, though, that there is more vigour on the right amongst young Christians than is visible on the left. And I was struck, actually, at the National Conservative Conference, the first one, which was held in Britain back in the spring here, that quite a lot of the young activists were people of faith, and which gives me, I think, some encouragement, because I think that it is those people who are putting up the most active resistance to the oddities, the peculiarities, not to say the craziness of some of the woke agenda.
Yes, I mean, I think one has to be very careful not to read across from, conservative in faith to conservative in politics.
No, absolutely.
Or vice versa. I think there have been some very good Christians on the left. I think of my old friend Frank Field, for example, a man of deep faith and a real pillar of the Church of England. Sadly, Anglicans like him are becoming rarer now, but still, for all his differences with the Labour Party, very clearly a man of the left, with very deep commitments to the poor and to the underprivileged and the suffering, and that's a very important part of the mix. But I take your point absolutely that when it comes to the young, I see much more sign that people on the sort of moderate centre-right are prepared to be a sign of contradiction, to use that phrase that, again, John Paul II used, a sign of contradiction to society, prepared to stand up and be counted, even if that means being cancelled, which of course is a rather vague term, but it means being certainly criticised and possibly losing a job. It can be as bad as that. Now, I have never done that, but I can remember when I even worked for the Daily Telegraph, people looking rather askance, when I wrote about matters of faith, and I don't think it did my career much good, put it that way. It puts you into a sort of oddball category, yes. Which not everyone would want to do. That said, I do think that having a sort of moral compass, a set of core principles, is a good thing in almost any profession, really. And I'm not sure that I would want to be in any line of work where that wasn't expected of me. I think one is put here on earth for a reason, and if you can't look back over your life and feel that you've made a difference, that you've helped people, that you've made the world a little bit better, then what on earth is the point? And I do think that having a coherent set of beliefs, which any faith worth its salt does give you, then that is a very good starting point for making a positive difference to our world and upholding that civilization which I mentioned earlier, of which we're all the beneficiaries, believers and unbelievers alike. We all benefit hugely from that great sort of legacy, that combination of Judeo-Christian principles and the classical world, the medieval world, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. These are all, in a sense, products of the same civilization, and I think you always need Jerusalem as well as Athens and Rome. Without Jerusalem, Athens and Rome will crumble to dust. But Jerusalem is that shining city on the hill, which gives us something to live for.
You've already alluded to that fantastic moment back in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and then rapidly thereafter the whole of the Soviet Union collapsed. And it did seem, or it could be interpreted at that moment as a triumph of Christian civilization, a triumph against a godless atheistic state, which was purposefully and explicitly atheistic, and in which Christians were persecuted. And that seemed, to some of us at the time, a moment of victory, as it were. But since then, I don't know. I feel that maybe the battle has swung the other way. It's as if we've lost ground as a Christian civilization since that moment.
Well, I think history is an endless battle between good and evil. That was a great moment, no question about it, and through the great inspiration that John Paul II provided in Poland to the Solidarity movement, I think one can say that Christianity made a very palpable, significant, indeed indispensable difference to that moment. Without that it couldn't have happened. Of course, we're now living in dark times when war has returned to Europe, a very terrible war too, in which atrocities are being committed by the Russians, sadly in the name of Christianity in some cases. The Russian Orthodox Church has allowed itself to be used, as has occasionally happened before in history, as a sort of shield for some terrible, terrible crimes. So this is not a good moment, perhaps, for a kind of triumphalist interpretation of Christianity. However, it's all back there in the Bible, isn't it? These terrible sort of catastrophes that befall the Jewish people. My father has in his painting studio in the garden a beautiful copy of a great painting which I think is in the Vatican by Guido Reni of St. Michael, the Archangel, triumphing over Satan. This is the sort of primeval battle long before even, mankind comes on the scene. It's described beautifully by Milton in Paradise Lost. And that sort of cosmic conflict has a reality. I'm not going to start talking about, where we can see the work of the devil in the world. I don't presume to, that's not my kind of faith. But I know that in one's own heart, these struggles take place. Every day we know the temptations, we know the times when we give in. So that's never going to go away because it's part of being human. But I think we can still look to the future with some confidence and with optimism and with hope. Perhaps hope is a better word than optimism. Optimism implies a sort of slightly blind belief that everything's getting better, the best of all possible worlds. it probably isn't the best of all possible worlds, but it is the world that we have, and it is a very wonderful world for all the bad things that human beings do in it. And so there is always hope, and even in the moments of despair, when we see terrible crimes being committed, we know that in the end good will triumph. There must have been very dark days in the Second World War when people came very close to despair across the continent. I've just published in the article a piece by the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, about two Polish farmers who have just been declared martyrs for their sacrifice on behalf of the Jews. They hid 6 Jewish escapees, people who were being sought by the Nazis during the Second World War. And then, alas, they were found in 1944, and the whole family, their children, everyone were shot dead by the Nazis, and of course so were the Jewish, their protégés. And these were very simple people, but they did the right thing. Now, most of us perhaps wouldn't make such a great sacrifice, but these were remarkable people, recognised as such at Yad Vashem, among the righteous of the Gentiles. And there are, but such actions are not unique. They are common enough that we can all aspire, at least, to show courage in the face of adversity. I do think courage is a very important Christian virtue, actually, and one sees it, with Jesus himself as he approaches his end, in extraordinary courage, and the willingness to not to compromise, even when faced by the representative of the Roman Empire, Pontius Pilate. He stands his ground. And it is Pontius Pilate who asks that famous question, what is truth? He, in a sense, represents the relativistic modern world, which tries to deny that there is any such thing, really, as truth, certainly any sort of God-given truth. Whereas, on the other hand, you have this lone, extraordinary man, not just any old man, but he was a man, and prepared to defy the might of the greatest empire in the world, and even the leaders of his own faith. I think that's something to bear in mind when we get despondent, when we watch the news and we think, how could that possibly have happened? How can people do these cruel things to each other?
Of course, we don't live, thank God, in heroic times like that. Most of the daily struggle which we encounter is on a much more humdrum level, isn't it? And of course it's these stories about I read a book recently about the White Rose group in Nazi Germany, the youngsters who stood up against Nazism in a very naive way, really, and you might say, well, what did they achieve? But our own struggles are carried out in a very, as I say, humdrum way, and it's sometimes difficult, isn't it, to to see the heroism which we are called upon to demonstrate.
You're right. I mean, the opportunity to do good deeds doesn't come up every day necessarily, but when it comes, you have to answer. I think that's the thing. We aren't all called to do as the Scholl brother and sister did, printing out these leaflets, telling the truth about what the Nazis had done, and being executed for doing that at a very young age. But we get more sort of humble opportunities. I mean, the other day it was a very, very stressful day because my wife and I were giving a party, the first time in years since long before the pandemic, and we had all these friends coming, and we were trying to get the house ready and so on. And I'd rushed out to get some last-minute provisions. Suddenly the telephone rang, and it was a quavering voice of an elderly professor, not a man I knew very well, but a very good scholar and a good man. And he was desperate. It was a bank holiday weekend. He was on his own. He was very frail. He had no food in the fridge. He was almost literally starving. And he said, everyone's away. There's no one to help. I just need someone to go to the supermarket and bring me some food. And so I thought, my heart sank, and I thought, how on earth can I do this? But somehow I managed to do it, needs must, you just feel you'll find a way to answer a call like that. And I'm not claiming any virtue to myself, I think anyone else would have done the same. But I got there, and poor man, he was in a bad state, and, his flat was not very clean. And so the next thing was to sort of mobilise his friends and make sure that there were people to come and help. And when you encounter somebody who's actually in need like that, and it may be, very often is, someone in your own family, an elderly relative, or it may be a little child, or just someone who's in trouble, who's got into difficulties, financial, or they've, just been dumped by the person they love, or whatever it is, coming to their rescue, it is the most wonderful thing, isn't it? It gives you a sense that your life is not in vain.
Indeed.
And I'm not saying there's no monopoly of people of faith when it comes to that sort of thing, but I think it helps. I think to have that little spur at the back of your mind, you know what you should do here. You do know what you ought to be doing. That moral imperative. I mean, Kant tried to secularize this, by saying, turning it into a sort of philosophical idea that, you should ask yourself whether your action would still be valid if it were universalized, if everybody, in every walk of life was asked in the same situation. But actually, all he was doing really was generalizing that basic love of neighbour, which is at the heart of Christ's teaching, and which he in turn develops out of much older Jewish teaching. So being there for our neighbours, being there for society, trying to do something for the common good, is absolutely essential. And I think this applies, by the way, across the political spectrum. I think it's so often, actually, in history, you find it's quite conservative people who are the ones who, in the end, enact the key reform. It isn't always the most wild, radical firebrands, of the left who do that. It's quite often, rather more modest figures. And people who are not fashionable. Margaret Thatcher, who's probably the most impressive politician I've ever been lucky enough to meet, she wasn't a fashionable kind of person. She didn't care about what people thought of her. She just tried to do the right thing. And funnily enough, since we were talking about saving people from the Nazis, you may or may not have known this, but her family took in a Jewish refugee from Vienna, from one of those families who were forced to scrub the pavements with toothbrushes by the brutal Nazi thugs. And this little girl came to live with them in Grantham, and she learned a lot from that experience. This was, while she was still a schoolgirl before the war. It brought it home to her what this war was actually about. And this may also explain why she was, for the rest of her life, profoundly philo-Semitic. She was that kind of conservative and didn't have much time for any other kind. I think conservatives ought to admire the Jewish people, really, as my father certainly did. He wrote their history, after all. And many of my Jewish friends say, well, you you needed to be someone like him at a bit of a distance to sort of get that perspective. You know, if you're part of it, it's harder. And Jews don't always agree, by the way, and that's another point, just like everyone else. And so, you know, it's important when you're telling the whole story, the sort of synoptic story of a whole people, not to get too factional, you know, not to side with one interpretation of what it is to be Jewish against another. But anyway, just to get back to what we were talking about, I think faith is essential to the work ethic. You were talking about, you know, how it affects one's work, and I do think that even if it's only a faith in yourself, you do need something in order to just get through the day. But the trouble with making yourself into a sort of God is you're going to let yourself down sooner or later, and so that's probably not enough. You know, we do need to believe in something beyond ourselves, if only because we're called on earth, after all, to pass this on to our children. And I never forget that the very first commandment, even before the 10 Commandments, is go forth and multiply. And we live in a society where people are having fewer and fewer children, and Europe especially is, in some countries we are literally dying out. And this is not, I think, what God intended for us. It's true that the world as a whole, there are more people than ever before, but I do worry about my own children and grandchildren, whether they will live in a world where they will want to pass on their own what they've learnt and what they've experienced to the next generation, for there to be another generation. I do think that having children is a great sort of vote in favour of the future and of hope and of a higher being, another world, something beyond ourselves.
Well, I agree with that, absolutely. Daniel Johnson, thank you very much indeed for that conversation, which I much enjoyed, and thank you for your insights. It was fascinating.
Thank you very much, Robin. I've enjoyed it very much.
If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.